It's Random Thoughts again, and today let's talk about the impact of colonialism on Kenyan music. Today, many people would agree that we have what we can call Kenyan music. But of course, that music has evolved over time, and that music has had influence from different corners. And colonialism has had the biggest impact, we can say, on Kenyan music, or at least one of the biggest impacts. Now, of course, obviously, right from the beginning, Kenya itself is a creation of colonialism. Before the arrival of the British, there was nothing like Kenya. The people who lived on this land, of course, they existed as different nations, as different groups that occupied different parts of the land, and they had their own governance structures and government and things like that. And so when we talk of Kenyan music, of course, we have to talk of colonialism, because we can't have Kenyan music without Kenya being in existence. Now, as I've said, before the arrival of the British, Kenya, the land we know today as Kenya, had many nations existing on it. And each of these had its own culture, way of life, traditions, and of course, art, music. And the type of music that existed in these, we can call them nations, was unique to each. Of course, it can be argued, and it's most likely was the case, that one community did influence the other in terms of the music and things like that. But by and large, each of them had its own music, its own way of doing it, and how the music was used, and of course the different types of music that were sung in that community. Of course, music has always been very important to African communities. Music marks birth, music marks initiation, music marks the start of a marriage, music marks even death. When an African dies, traditionally, music will be part of the ceremony that goes on. Of course, music also played one other major function within these communities. It was through music, by and large, that history was preserved and passed along from one generation to another. And even the culture itself was preserved in music and then passed along from one generation to another. So music has always been a very critical part of the communities that have lived on the land we know today as Kenya. Now, when the British arrived, initially, of course, they didn't care so much about the music that was going on around. And I remember I was reading recently the diary of Richard Maynard Sagen, who came to Kenya early 1902 and stayed here maybe up to 1906, and he does talk about him going to Fort Hall, which is Moranga today, and the local people performing music for them. And the way he describes the music, he had so much contempt for it. He thought it was evil, even it was very immoral. The way he describes it, he wasn't amused by it. It was just that he had to endure the performance because it was part of what they had to do when they arrived, and there were these groups of local people who came to welcome them. Now, but over time, of course, music became one of those aspects of African way of life that the British had to change. And one way that happened was through the conversion of Africans into Christianity. Now, Christianity, the way it was packaged when it arrived here, it was packaged as the best way to live, and it was packaged as the best culture, of course. And that also meant that the local African culture was the opposite of it. That's at least how it was initially presented. Like, the way you people live is the dark way, and Christianity is the way with the light. And so everything that was African was demonized to a large extent, and that of course includes the music and the songs that people used to perform. And so when Africans became Christians, of course they started associating some of the music that they used to perform, they started associating them with the dark. And so they kind of like abandoned that, and they encouraged one another to abandon that so that they become proper Christians. And as the church became the center of many villages around the country, of course, that impact became even more. And of course, the African music was, of course, replaced by the Christian songs. And most of these were choral songs that were taught at the church, and then the locals were encouraged to perform them. These songs were eventually translated into local languages. And if you go to the villages today, there are so many songs that people sing that are very old. And if you follow closely, you realize that they were English songs that were translated into local languages, and the people were taught these songs, and they, of course, embraced them, and they became part of the culture. Of course, this movement killed many of the indigenous songs and ways the songs were composed and performed. And today, maybe a lot of that were lost, and we don't have access to those traditional ancient songs that our communities used to sing or perform up until the arrival of the Europeans. We do have some that still exist, but I can bet a huge chunk of it was lost due to the conversion to Christianity, and of course due to the embracing of the Western way of life. Now, the Europeans, of course, introduced their own music, and as I've said, that started with the church. And of course, then they introduced new instruments. And we have to take note that Africans did have their own instruments: the Nyatiti, the obokano, the kayambas, and all these instruments that existed within the African communities. But the Europeans, of course, brought in new instruments: the guitar, the piano, and the accordion, which if you go to central Kenya, the accordion did have a huge influence on how the music in that part of Kenya evolved. When you go to Nyanza, the Luoland, the guitar became the music instrument that basically shaped the music that emerged, the benga as we call it. When you go to Central Province, the accordion played a major role because it gave what came to be known as mwomboko, which was basically a way of dancing and singing. And most people today will say mwomboko is the traditional music of people of Central Kenya, but mwomboko didn't exist, at least not in the way it is today or the way we've come to know it, until the arrival of the accordion, because the accordion is at the core of what mwomboko is. So, of course, these new instruments shaped the music that the Africans were creating and composing and performing. Now, and then the radio came along, 1920s, the first radio being set up in East Africa, in Kenya in particular. And the radio, of course, initially was set up for the settlers, for the white settlers, the Europeans, but of course the Africans also could listen to this radio. And of course, over time, the British decided to create programs that were specifically designed for the Africans. And in these programs, of course, music was played, and they were not going to play purely European music. Of course, they did that, but local artists emerged and they started composing music. Now, the earliest composers or artists, Kenya artists, were mostly people copying music from the West. And I need to point something else out, that of course, Kenya was colonized by the British, and the British moved here, they brought Christianity, but there was also a huge flow of American missionaries, and these missionaries also had a huge impact of the music that emerged in Kenya. In particular, they brought in country music, and this country music became so attractive to the local people. And you'd notice that the earliest African artists from Kenya basically were composing and performing music that sounded country music-like, or they were a version of it. And if you listen to music by people like Sami Ngaku, you listen to music by Herbert Misengo, John Nzenze, Francis Rugwiti. In fact, Francis Rugwiti even sang a song titled Señorita, which is Don Williams has a song, Señorita, and Don Williams is one of the most influential country music artists. And that tells you these people used to listen to country music a lot. We have Kipchamba Tapotuk. If you listen to, especially to his earliest recordings, you come to realize that it has a lot of country music touch. And so the missionaries the American missionaries did have a huge influence on Kenyan music. And of course, as I've said, the British also had this impact, especially through the church, of course. And then the radio comes along, as I've said, and the radio has always been a gate, and there are gatekeepers, of course, and through the radio, of course, it will be determined which music goes to the population and which music doesn't go. And the British were able to control how that happened. I was reading some document which I found to be very interesting, and it was about A.P. Chandarana. Now, if you don't know who A.P. Chandarana is, A.P. Chandarana can be said to be the one person who made Benga to be Benga, what it is, or what it became. And AP Chandarana, while he was based not in Nairobi but in Kericho, he recorded music for artists from all over Kenya, and in fact from Tanzania, in fact all the way to Congo and Zimbabwe and Malawi. Yeah, he recorded music for people from all over the place. And AP Chandarana, most of the early artists you will know of Benga in Kenya, almost all of them were recording with Chandarana. Chandarana took the market in the 1950s. Before Chandarana, most of the recording studios were owned by the British. And I was reading this piece where it was said that the British producers used to be very harsh to the local artists. And of course, they used to guide them to tell them, yes, you can sing about that. No, you can't sing about that. And of course, that explains why, for example, the early artists very quickly started singing about love, for example, and not so much about politics and culture, because the British wouldn't entertain you talking about political issues in your songs. They would not even record that song. So that guided how the music evolved, of course, and now the artists started singing more about love and romance and all those things, and they abandoned or they did not touch topics like politics, and very few of them, of course, did try. But if you listen to the old music, you realize that the music that talks about politics, for example, to some extent, or historical events, this is music that was recorded by people like AP Chandarana, who was not British, or these are music that was recorded maybe after independence, 1960s. So the radio and then the recording studios shaped how the music evolved, because these were, we can say, gatekeepers of how the music was consumed, produced, and consumed. And on the aspect of the Europeans controlling the artist, that piece also talks about how, with time, after AP Chandarana set up his studio in Kericho, African artists found it easier to work with Chandarana because Chandarana didn't treat them as kids. The European producers will treat these artists basically as kids, telling them how to even stand and and there was a particular issue, especially among the artists from Luo land, because among the Luos they used to remove the front lower teeth, and then when they are singing they kind of like whistle somehow, and the British of course didn't like that, and they will force them to wear some dentals or something like that, and they didn't like it, and these dentals they will share, everybody will have to put them on. You put them on, you remove somebody else. So they didn't like it. Of course, it wasn't hygienic. But Chandarana found a way to have them sing without wearing those things, and then the sound will still come out okay, like with no issues. The point is, the British really controlled the kind of music that came out from the African artists. Now, of course, the music has evolved over time. What started as copying country music, for example, has evolved to become Mogithi in Central Province. Mogithi started as copying country, but now it's a completely new genre. It's a unique genre. But if you listen carefully, you will realize that this is basically country music. So music has evolved. Benga started the way it started. Now it is completely something else. It has evolved. And all music, of course, evolved with time. And of course, after independence, the impact of the West did not stop. The impact of the West on the Kenyan music did not stop. Of course, today, everybody will look at it and will agree that our local music, the so-called pop music, for example, has so much influence from the Americans, even the hip-hop in particular. Whatever young artist comes up, they want to sound American. The more you sound American, the high quality people think your music is. So the impact or the influence has not really ended, and it goes on. Yeah, so colonization created and shaped what has become to be known as the Kenyan music. Those are my random thoughts.